Hey friends, Alison Ramirez, Christian author, editor, and content creator, here today to talk to you about my fiction books. So I have two fiction books that are currently out. This is the first one. This is called The Divided Kingdom. It's a YA dystopian fiction novel. This book came out last year in March. And then this is my recent publication. This is the sequel, book 2 in the series, The Exile. And my goal is to release book 3, which is going to be called The Return, the final book in the series, next year. So the topic of today's video, as you might have been able to tell from these two books here, is writing sequels. When I first set out to be an author, I had the goal of just publishing a book. I wanted to be able to say I was a published author. And then when I wrote this book, I realized that there was more of the story to be told. And so when I set out to write, I didn't have a whole plot pre-planned for all 3 books in the trilogy. So that's called being a plotter. The other alternative is to be a pantser, where you kind of just write by the seat of your pants as ideas come to you. So once I finished book 1, I realized there's actually more of the story to tell. So I started working on this book, and then when I finished this book, I was already having like inklings of ideas for a third and final book. So I wanted to talk to you today about tips for writing a sequel, meaning that you write one book and then the story with the same characters basically continues on, spills over into one or more future books. And so my first tip would be to remember that every book, even if it's part of a series, you need to have a story within a story. For example, each book should have a clear beginning, middle, and an end. And you want your readers, ideally, to be able to read the books individually and have the story still make sense. For example, someone should be able to pick up my second book in the series and be able to understand it completely without having read the first book. This is a way that people can join the series at any point in the process and the story is still going to make sense to them. Even though it's an overarching mega story that you're taking your readers through with each book, you want to have each book like wrap up the story enough so that it feels like a fulfilling end to your readers, while at the same time leaving room for that next story to be told. So that's my first tip. Second tip would be, what's helpful when you're writing a sequel or a series is to actually put the next 2 chapters of the second book at the end of the first book. Now, obviously, if you're still in the process of writing the next book, you might not be able to do this immediately. But for example, once I finished book 2, The Exile, I was able to add the first 2 chapters of this book to the end of book 1. This is a great way to entice your readers to keep going. Like, they finish book 1, they want to know what happens next, and they can already get a sneak peek into book 2's chapter. Same thing with when I do finish book 3 in this series, I'll add the first 2 chapters to book 2. Again, it just gets the reader interested and it makes them more likely to want to purchase the next book in the series. Okay, third tip would be unified covers. So this is something that I did not realize at the beginning, and actually let me find the book on my shelf so I can show it to you. Okay, so when I first wrote the first book, The Divided Kingdom, it did not have this cover. It had a different cover, which looks like this. Okay, so this was the original cover, and then this was the cover redesign. I realized I was just looking for anybody to do my cover, and this first cover is not terrible by any means, but I realized that it didn't really capture the whole series theme that I wanted to go with, specifically that I'm writing a dystopian science fiction novel. So my new cover designer was able to redesign the cover, and as you can see, it blends beautifully with what ended up being the book 2 cover. So you can see it's got the same font for the main cover. It's got the same style of like a main character on the front that's kind of like fading in, fading out. You can see even some of the setting details are the same. Looking at the back cover, again, same font, same style there. You can look at the spines, also the same. And so this just lends to the series seeming cohesive and a combined unit for readers, because again, even though you're telling individual stories, they're still together, interwoven as one large story. So that would be my third tip. Okay, fourth tip. So it's really important to have your main characters, but you also want to have sub-characters that you can unravel and shape as the story moves forward, because when you have multiple books, you have an opportunity for your readers to get to know more characters. Obviously, you have more pages, more books to work with than just having to have everything figured out in the first book. For example, I've had characters that were playing minor roles in the first book, but then they had a much bigger role in, say, book 2, or will have a bigger role in book 3. And so you're not necessarily locked in with your first book in the series on who's the most important character or who has a story to tell. You can interweave deeper and more complex stories to some of your minor characters that become major characters in, say, future books. So keep that in mind as you're writing. It's kind of something fun that you might not expect. You know, a character that you thought was just a small little role ends up having a major role. It can kind of surprise you as you're writing. Okay, and then my fifth piece of advice is don't leave anything forgotten in your series. What I mean by this is that you might write something in book 1 and then you kind of like forget to ever mention it again in the future books, and readers are like, whatever happened to so-and-so? Or whatever happened to this, you know, this plot piece? For example, in my first book, I had this little tiny like squirrel chipmunk type character that I like mentioned briefly in book 1, and then I realized I never mentioned that animal ever again, and readers might be left wondering like, whatever happened to that creature? So yeah, that's why it can help to have some sense of like a tentative outline, just so that there's not something that just like is randomly mentioned and then is like never brought up again for the rest of the book. So that would be my last piece of advice, and hopefully this was helpful to you. Again, I never set out wanting to write a series or thinking that I would, but it's been a lot of fun, and it's a way to keep your characters alive and basically see their story progress more throughout multiple books. So it's not always easy to write a series or a sequel, but if it works for you and you see your world being larger than you expected, don't be afraid to explore that option. Also works really great as far as marketing goes, because if you can hook your reader with one book, then you can have them, you know, be interested in multiple books and be able to kind of carry those readers with you and have them more invested than just one book, and then you write a completely different book that they may or may not be interested in. So hopefully this was helpful. Keep you in my prayers, and happy writing.